founder of Black Hat, Jeff Moss.
Hey, good morning, everyone. See, we've all mostly survived. A few empty seats. I think they're in the hospital recovering. We've done really well on our first day. Today we're kicking off with a keynote by Jen Ellis that follows some of the themes from Daniel from yesterday. She'll be talking about cybersecurity, the next generation. And I believe Jen is in a really interesting position to talk about this because she's highly engaged in the community. She contributes a lot of her time trying to make the world a better place, either through policy, through coordination. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about how she spends all of her time. She's a co-host of a Security Nation podcast. She's a co-chair on the Ransomware Task Force, which we've all heard of. She sits on the board of the Center for Cybersecurity Policy and Law. She's a member of the Board of Advisors for the Cyber Peace Institute, CPI, the Global Science Cyber Alliance. She helps organize the DEF CON policy initiative that we have. She's on the Aerospace Village. She's on the board of I Am the Cavalry. She serves with me on the UK Government Cyber Advisory Board. And it goes on and on. Amazing contributions. But I think she said the thing she's most proud of as a Brit is flying to America and testifying in front of Congress and being the opposition witness. And so after that, it's sort of all downhill. How many people get that opportunity? So it really is my privilege and honor to introduce Jen Ellis and really look forward to seeing what she has to say. So let's give her a warm welcome. Thank you.
Morning. Thank you to Jeff for that intro that made me sound like I never have any downtime at all. And thank you to Black Hat for inviting me here. And thank you, more importantly, to all of you who made a 9 a.m. presentation, particularly to those of you who perhaps enjoyed the, what do they call it, networking events? Is that what they call them? So I would like to invite you to join me as we boldly go on an adventure to look into the future of security and how all of you can play a role in shaping it. This is probably the moment at which I should apologize to anyone who hates Star Trek, because there's going to be a bit of a theme. I hope that none of you hate Star Trek. I should also explain, by the way, that the goal of this talk is not really to have everybody agree with me, because I'm very used to that never happens, but is more to inspire you guys to think about what you might do to help shape the future of security. And if you want to play a role in that, maybe you don't, but it's up to you. So, we're coming to the end of 2022. And 40 years ago, the RSA Corporation was founded, which is sort of the first of the big security companies that kind of hung around. And a couple of years after that, we saw the first commercial AV solutions. So you can sort of approximately say that the security industry as an industry is about 40 years old. And we know that generally speaking, a generation is considered to be 20 or 30 years. So it's somewhat fair to say that we're in the second generation of the security industry. I think that it sort of matters because often generations like to think about what went before and how they're going to do things differently. How are they going to forge a brighter, newer future? And yesterday we had a fantastic keynote from Dan, and he talked about how we're trying to build a defendable internet. And one of the things he sort of mentioned is there's lots of good things happening, but this community could maybe be doing a little bit more or a little bit differently. So I wanted to kind of pick that thread up and look at what does that mean? What does it mean to think about doing things a little bit differently and perhaps changing the approach to mature the industry a little bit, right? So that's the goal of today. So a lot of the people who are in the first generation of the cybersecurity profession, like these gentlemen here, who worked for Loft-heavy industries, they're now in a position where they actually are business leaders, some of them work in the government, some of them are retiring with the hard-earned money that they have earned through a career in security. These guys testified to US Congress in 1998. And the chap in the middle, who is Peter Zatko, better known as Mudge, he said that he could take the internet down in 30 minutes or less. Quick show of hands, does anybody remember this from 98? Some of you, I think, perhaps were not born in 98. I'm not going to focus on that too much. I was finishing up high school, and I did not have a particular interest in security at the time. And I remember seeing this on the news, because it made the news globally. And I thought, that sounds mad. And, you know, as a normal teenager, I was quite interested in the internet. And so I went to my dad, who was an IT director at the time, and I asked him about this. And it probably won't shock you too much to know that as an IT director, he didn't know a huge amount about security. And so he sort of looked vaguely horrified, but had no answers for me. So I remember this as a point in time in history, and it, I think, really is the first point when I got interested in security. So let's fast forward to 2018. This was the 20th anniversary, and again, these same people, now with much fancier suits and haircuts, they went and they testified again. And this time they didn't make claims about closing down the internet in 30 minutes or less, but they did say that a lot of the same issues they had talked about 20 years earlier were still present. And they talked about how the complexity is only increasing. This is something that Jeff mentioned yesterday. Complexity is only increasing, the attack surface is increasing, so the fact that we're still seeing the same issues is a real problem. And I think this is something that security professionals are generally fairly familiar with. You know, we hear a lot in security about how we continue to see the same types of bugs over and over again. We still see cross-site scripting, we still see SQL injection. It's super annoying that we're still dealing with unsupported legacy systems and default passwords. And these things keep coming up and up again. So, the slide everyone was waiting for, it's very easy to understand that security people can be a little jaded, a little cynical. Maybe you know somebody that represents that. Sometimes even a little depressed. In fact, one of the things we hear in security is that nothing ever changes. I'm going to do something they did yesterday. I'm going to ask for a show of hands. How many people have either said this about security or have heard somebody else complain this about security? Okay, not as bad as I thought. Right, well, I'm here to challenge it. I think that as much as we see those same annoying bugs, and it is annoying, I think actually quite a lot changes. I think context changes, and I think it matters. So when I think about cyber risk, I think of three main areas of behavior that help shape cyber risk. That is the behavior of technology manufacturers, the behavior of large-scale technology operators, and the behavior of adversaries. These categories of behavior also influence each other, right? They also change each other and they respond to each other. So let's look at what's happening with technology manufacturers first. So I think it's pretty easy and obvious to say that the landscape in tech is always changing, right? In 40 years that we've had a security industry, technology has changed massively. One of the biggest things has been the huge explosion of adoption of IoT and mobility technologies. And this is really relevant to security for a couple of reasons. One is, obviously, hugely increases both the attack surface and the compute resources available to attackers. But the other reason that this is really important is traditionally when we think about cyber risk, we're thinking only about the cyber domain. We're thinking about virtual harm. What IoT does is it creates a bridge from virtual to physical, and all of a sudden now we're talking about the potential for physical harm. And with that also comes massive economic impact, massive societal impact. So this changes the stakes. It changes how we think about the impact of cyber risk and is important from that point of view. And in fact, it's so important that governments have responded. So yesterday, Dan showed a picture of a guy called David Rogers, and he worked with the UK government, with DCMS, and he came up with this code of practice for consumer IoT. And this code, which is 13 basic principles for building secure by design, was then adopted by ETSI, the European Standards Agency, and it was turned into what's called an EN. So EN 303645, for those who are standards nerds like me. What that means is that all of the member states of the European Union have to adopt it. So this has now gone across Europe. And further, because now the Australian government has adopted it, the Indian government has adopted it, and other governments are starting to build on top of it. So this is actually a super influential piece of work, but also represents how much governments are focusing on the problem of IoT because they're very concerned about the potential impact on society. So the next big change is the shift to cloud and on-demand. We saw this accelerate during the pandemic. And from a security point of view, one of the things that's interesting about this is that it creates that sort of confusion or lack of certainty around where responsibility lies for securing your stuff, right? Who really owns that responsibility? And for operators, it can be a real challenge, right? If you are a large-scale operator and you are providing on-demand services, you now have a huge responsibility to provide availability. From a client point of view, what is your responsibility? How do you manage this risk? You have to rely much more on your provider. And actually, for the adversaries, it makes for really juicy targets, right? We saw this play out when we've seen attackers go after a single organization with vast customer base. And so there's a huge impact there. And then, Dan talked about this yesterday, we've seen a new era of AI and ML. Dan talked about ChatGPT, because I think he's had some fun playing with it recently. And he talked about how, when you're looking at AI and ML, integrity becomes much, much more important. So let's look at that. So he referenced yesterday the classic CIA triad that we have in security: confidentiality, integrity, and availability of data. We've had this triad forever and a day, probably for 40 years. But really, in the past, we focused on confidentiality of data. That was really what it was all about. Whether your attackers were sort of perhaps politically motivated or profit motivated, really it was all about maintaining secrecy. And we still see this being really, really important. The rise of double extortion attacks shows that keeping data confidential is still a huge priority. But now, availability is also a priority. We saw this first with the rise of DDoS attacks, and more recently with the huge explosion in ransomware attacks. Availability has become paramount. And it has a huge impact on the economy when we have a loss of availability. So availability is a huge priority now. But again, as we talked about, when you're looking at AI and ML models, really it's about the integrity of data. And that's the thing you have to build in from the ground up. You can't kind of go back and fix it later. So all of a sudden, integrity becomes a priority in a way it wasn't. And so now, rather than just being able to focus on one, we're focusing on all three. And which one matters the most to you will depend on your specific organization, your specific threat profile. So the level of complexity that we're dealing with as defenders has increased. The burden has increased. So maybe I'm persuading you that things have changed, but in a really depressing way. Good morning to you all. So now let's look at operators. It's a broad term. It can go from being your sort of classic individual consumer using their phone through to being large-scale operators that can be infrastructure as a service providers, mobile providers. You know, they're all operators, right? So there's a huge spectrum in there, everything in between. And there have been changes. The obvious one is that during the pandemic, we saw this big adoption of remote working. We don't know if that'll stick around, but I think more flexible working probably will. And much like IoT, what this means is that the attack surface continues to increase, the complexity continues to increase. In security, we always say, oh, the perimeter's dead. But actually, every individual working on their sofa in their shorts is a point on your perimeter, and you have to think about how to protect them. So the complexity is increasing. And of course, they love to plug stuff in. They love to go buy stuff without talking to security. And how are you meant to secure things that you don't know about, that you can't find? So that increases the complexity and the risk. And then we've got supply chain risk, which we already talked about a little bit. And everybody at the moment is being tasked with that thing of like, oh, you've got to figure out how to not just vet it for security when you're getting it, but then figure out how to maintain that vetting over time. What does that even look like? And that leads us to this magical solution, zero trust, which we haven't really talked about how we make that practical over the long run and at scale. So there's a lot going on for operators right now, and adversaries love to take advantage of it. And so, yes, they too no longer look how they used to. Thank you. I appreciate that somebody found that funny. So we used to talk about script kiddies, and we used to talk about disorganized, opportunistic attackers. And now we talk about people who are run like businesses. We talk about people who send emails about HR problems and who book time off. We talk about highly complex and sophisticated organizations and their bosses who drive around in Lamborghinis. It's not the attackers we used to deal with. They have their own industry, their own complex markets, where they have specialists, the same as we do, arguably better organized, because they're not competing in the same way we are. And now they have this relationship with governments as well. So one of the things we talk about when we're talking about criminal groups is we talk about nations that are safe havens. They either can't or they won't prosecute criminal groups, which enables the criminals to thrive and survive. And in some cases, we know that a part of the reason they won't prosecute is because actually their criminal activities further the goals of the government. So that's the thing that you guys now have to deal with. And that's tough. So I would say that actually, I think quite a lot changes in security, and it matters because it means that, one, the stakes have changed, the impact has changed, and that means the focus has changed. All of you who do this job every day, who've thought about security for a long time, you're now under scrutiny of governments and of business leaders and of the attackers. So I think that it comes to us to say, what we're doing isn't working. We're not winning. And I'm sorry, that's not a positive message for this time in the morning, or any time in the morning, really. But I think that because we have so many people that are so passionate about security, people who will come to Excel for 2 days to learn more about security, I think that we have the potential to do things differently and to do more. And I'm not suggesting that you guys all have to take on a second job. I know that I have a problem saying no to things, clearly. But you guys, you're busy, and I get it. You already have a full-time job. I'm not suggesting you have to do more. What I'm asking you to do is think about whether there are small things that you could change, that you do things differently, and it helps to become a better advocate for security. Because ultimately, we can't fight this battle alone anymore. We've been doing that, and it doesn't work. So we have to break out of the vacuum, and we have to figure out ways of driving buy-in with the rest of the world. Now I will pause. Dun, dun, dun. I'm doing this for dramatic effect. So, it's a big number. In 2022, cybercrime is estimated that it will cost the global economy $7 trillion. Now, I don't know, maybe you're really good with your numbers. I'm one of those people that I look at that and I'm like, I don't know what that means. So to give you a little bit of context, the GDP, the gross domestic product of the UK, which is the sixth biggest GDP in the world, is about 2.64 trillion. 7 trillion is about equivalent to the combined GDPs of the UK, France, and Brazil. So, which are 6, 7, and 8 on the list. So it's a lot of money. It's a lot of money. And not only is it costing the world a lot of money, but also it's become a part of international diplomacy. We saw this play out in the run-up to the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and We saw some pretty heavy conversations between Presidents Biden and Putin. And we have had a lot of discourse around what might happen in hacking around the world and how it might impact private citizens, not just governments, because we now effectively are kind of pawns in this game. So all of this means that policymakers are going to pay a lot of attention to security. They're going to try and figure out how can they make a difference and change the dynamics. In this year, in the UK alone, we have had 3 cybersecurity-related laws drafted or updated. We've had 6 government consultations on a wide range of cybersecurity-related topics, and additional 2 parliamentary inquiries, just this year. If we look more globally, this is a selection. This is not exhaustive. This is a selection of cybersecurity-related topics that governments around the world are actively working on today. If you would like more on this, here is a shameless plug. There will be a session at 1:30, and I am very excited because Irfan Hamani from the Department of Digital Culture, Media and Sport is coming to talk to you guys, which is kind of awesome. They're from the government and they want to help. I think that might be a US phrase, but in any case, they'll be here and Irfan will be here and it'll give you an opportunity to ask more questions, but he'll go through what the UK government is looking at the moment. And the thing is, whether you want to get involved with it or not, and maybe you don't, maybe you're super busy and you just don't want to do it, but the bottom line is, as a security professional, you will have to live with whatever they come up with. You'll be the people who are governed by it, directed by it. So it actually is really good for you guys to know what's coming. So another reason that all of this matters is the security industry is estimated to be worth $156 billion. I feel like I should do a little bit of this. Again, it's a big number. But what it means is that companies are spending a lot of money on security. And some of your companies will be benefiting from that, and that's great. But when companies spend a lot of money on something, they have an expectation. They expect professionalism. They expect a certain standard in how their service is provided and what they get. And we've seen this. We've seen the shift around understanding of who security professionals are. We see it even in the very imperfect way that the media represent us. We've gone from being sort of disaffected youth and shady government characters through some interesting, weird distractions on the way, to now an understanding that we are professionals. And sure, we might get represented as hoodie wearing. That's fairly accurate. I own quite a lot of black hoodies. And a little erratic. But now there's an understanding that we're professionals, and people expect us to behave like professionals. And that means that all of a sudden people go, well, there should be a standard. There should be a baseline for what I can expect when I hire a security professional. And that means certifications. This is not unique to security. If you look at any industry where you're dealing with complex issues and you've got trusted employees and there needs to be a standard, there are certifications. More than that, there are mandatory requirements. Security is not lacking in certifications. We actually have a ton, as you can see from the logos. What we're lacking in is alignment and agreement. And that's actually not unusual for us, right? We're an industry based on pointing out problems. We are professionally cynical. We have to be. There's nothing wrong with that. It's actually a great quality. What we're not so good at, though, is working together to find solutions and to find alignment. And that means that when you're looking at certifications, we can't agree. We don't agree. We like to point problems and poke holes, but not actually say, this is what we should do about it, and work together to build that. What that means in the context of this conversation is that if people decide that we should have mandatory certification, it will be handed to us rather than us having developed it for ourselves. So in the first half of this year, DCMS ran a consultation on professionalization of cybersecurity. One of the questions they asked is, should certification be mandated? Now, based on the response that they got, they decided that it should not be mandated at this time. It's a great phrase, that. If it doesn't send a shiver down your spine, it damn well should, honestly. Now, not mandated at this time, one, does not mean that they don't reserve the right to come back and mandate it later. They absolutely do. And two, it doesn't mean that they're not going to push voluntary certification. Now, government-backed certifications, even if they're voluntary, will carry weight, because all of a sudden companies will start looking for them when they start hiring. So even though it's not regulation, it still will impact all of you. And so, these are conversations that you as security professionals need to be part of, because it will shape your career. It will shape your experience. You're the one who will have to live with it. So these are things that it's hard to stay up on, I understand, but it's really good to have an opportunity to hear about it and to think about how you might get involved. And also think about, are there certifications you particularly like that you would support? Are there certifications that you think could be improved? How could you get involved in that? What would that look like? So the point of all of this really is to say that the bus is moving. The question is, do you want to be on the bus and helping decide where it stops and when, or do you want to be assimilated by the Borg and, have your orders handed to you? Now, the good news is that this is an amazing community. The security community is phenomenal, and so much great stuff is already happening. I've never seen a community that is so good at sort of sharing information and educating each other and sharing passion. And at these events, we see it so much, right? And it's a really wonderful thing. So we now have threat intel sharing groups. Some of them are kind of official and formal, like the ISACs, and some of them are very much community-oriented, volunteer, and that's awesome. It's great to have both. And actually, what's also awesome is to see them working with governments and saying, hey, we know that as governments, you're going to get to do disruptive activities that we can't do as individuals. Let us participate and help, which is really great. We've also seen a lot of security professionals volunteering and providing assistance to those who maybe are below the security poverty line, can't afford to do it themselves, nonprofits, for example, healthcare organizations. We saw a ton of this during the pandemic, and it made me just crazy proud to be part of this community. It's just a really, really wonderful thing to see. And then we also have this sort of real shift towards trying to educate and engage each other. We see this at DEF CON with the villages, which are so fantastic and fun. But today, a lot of this is within this community, right? We do it at these events. We do it at events like this. That's great. We should absolutely keep doing that. But we're talking in echo chambers. We're talking to each other all the time. We're not breaking out of these walls and talking to the communities that aren't engaged. Because it's hard, right? Who wants to go talk to people who are not engaged? It's much more fun to talk to people who are interested. But we have to figure out how to do that. So I Am the Cavalry is a grassroots volunteer organization that aims to put people with deep security expertise with people outside of the security industry who have an ability to influence outcomes in sectors where, to use their language, bits and bytes meet flesh and blood. It's a very graphic explanation of what they do. So, healthcare, transportation, infrastructure, giving security experts a runway to go talk to regulators or industry leaders in those sectors and to try and help create change so that they start building security in from the ground up. We need more initiatives like that that are aimed at breaking out of these echo chambers that we live in all the time. Public-private partnership is another thing. I think the UK is actually pretty good at this. We actually have a nice relationship with our government in this country. So there are programs like NCSC's Industry 100, where they provide a runway basically for industry to work with the government on solving real-world problems. I also love the No More Ransom project. Quick show of hands, how many people are familiar with No More Ransom? Not enough. See, this is the problem. So No More Ransom is a collaboration between law enforcement around the world and various security research entities and AV vendors. And the goal is to provide free decryption tools for ransomware attacks. What a great thing. It's practical. It solves a problem. It saves people money. I would love there to be more things like this. This is great. We also, as we've heard a little bit from Jeff, we are seeing more of the security community getting involved in policy engagement. It's the sort of pointy end of the stick, but it's there. So there are now some sort of cybersecurity advisory boards for the UK government. And not just the UK government, other governments around the world have these now, which is great. It's a huge development. Jeff mentioned the Cabinet Office has one, DCMS has some. These are really good. And then there's also open calls for views. Pretty much every government, pretty much every democratic government runs open calls for views and gives their people a chance to weigh in. As security experts, if they're talking about a security topic, they really, really want to hear from you. You are the people who have the knowledge to help them make sure they're doing the right thing. It's hard to keep up with these. It's hard to find out about them. That is a problem. It's something that governments need to work on how they do better to engage the community. But you also can take the steps to try and find out about this and to try and get involved. And then we're also seeing initiatives, like Jeff mentioned, policy at DEF CON, which are really designed to say, hey, we have a security community and we have a policy community. And they're different communities, but they share a goal. So we should help bring them together so that they can get to know each other and they can figure out how to work together. This is a great thing, but today, this largely only happens in the US, which is why I'm really excited that DCMS is coming here to speak to you guys, because we need to see more of that, right? And then there's a lot of nonprofits. So nonprofits could be think tanks, trade groups, industry associations that have started to advocate more around cybersecurity. Again, it's great to have more voices, but they're not the experts that you guys are. They know how to navigate a world based on trying to build norms and standards and how to get buy-in, but they don't have the expertise and security that you have from working on the front lines. There are also a number of corporate pledges. This is where companies basically commit that they will not do a thing or they will do a thing to try and advance security. There's mixed views on these, but it's great that companies are actually standing up and making commitments around security. And then there's a whole lot of stuff that's being done to try and develop new talent, and that's coming both from the government and the private sector, which is awesome because, as we always hear, there's a workforce development issue, and we need to solve it. Another really, really big topic that we're hearing about is around transparency of product security. And this is really trying to do two things. One, we're trying to create a more empowered consumer base. And hopefully over time, if we empower them more, they'll get more engaged and more interested, and they'll start asking questions rather than just having us throw information at them. And two, we're trying to hold product vendors more accountable for what they put out there and the decisions they make. Whether they prioritize or deprioritize security should be something people know. So some of the things that are happening in this area are software bill of materials, SBOM. Show of hands, how many people have heard of SBOM? Okay, that's good, lots of you. I bet most of you curse it. But the transparency aspect is good. The realities of how you do it is more of a work in progress. Coordinated vulnerability disclosure is another one that fits into this bucket that there's a really big push behind. Any CVD fans in here? Yes? Okay, some of you like CVD, that's good. Labeling. Labeling is something that's being looked at by a number of governments around the world. Singapore is running a process on this at the moment. The UK government looked into labeling for products and got some feedback that made them go, okay, this is not simple. This is going to be challenging. So we have to go back to the drawing board and think about it more. But there's generally this view that we need to have more transparency and more accountability. And then, of course, there's press coverage. Show of hands, how many people think that the mainstream press, not the security press that are in the room with us, but the mainstream press do a good job in the way they cover security? Yeah, I'm not entirely shocked by that response. It's good that we get coverage because it's good that we're raising awareness. The way that it's covered is not so great, as we all know, and creates problems. These front pages are from WannaCry. It's the 5th anniversary of WannaCry this year. And so, I was getting ready to do this talk, and I knew I was going to mention WannaCry, and so I asked a bunch of people. This is a very unscientific method. I just asked a bunch of people as I encountered them, people who don't work in security. I was like, hey, do you remember WannaCry? And everybody looked at me very blankly. And so then I went, well, do you remember the big cyber attack against the NHS that closed 80 hospitals across the country? And everybody looked at me very blankly. And I found that really depressing. That we could have a situation where hospitals closed up and down the country and people don't remember it, and the NHS got hit again this year, right? So, there is more to do, basically. And I get it that you guys are not sitting around all day, relaxing, going, oh, if only some annoying British woman would come and tell me, what should I do with my time? You're busy. You have full-time jobs. I'm not asking you to take on more. I'm asking you to think about whether there are small things that can be done differently. What can we do to address consumer apathy? It's a huge problem, right? Consumers are still reusing passwords. They don't really understand why it matters until they get hit. And then they really think it should be somebody else's problem to sort out for them. And we judge them constantly for it. We've spent 40 years telling people outside of security that security is really technical and they won't get it. And now they don't get it, and we go, oh, what's wrong with consumers? Why can't they get this? We did that. We have to fix it. And some of it we'll fix through technology and process. We'll make it so that they don't have a choice. We'll make multi-factor authentication the default, for example, which is not common enough today and needs to be more common. But some of it, much of it, will be done through engagement. We have to figure out how to talk to people differently. We have to figure out how to stop confusing the hell out of people. We rarely agree on anything. And again, as I said, our industry is based on pointing out problems. We're an industry that values accuracy, and we don't want to lose that. It's important. But when we talk to people outside of our industry, and we are so focused on that accuracy piece and being right and having the technical detail right, it's incredibly alienating. Whether you're talking to individual consumers or business leaders, it's incredibly alienating. They have no idea what to focus on. I've talked to security staff, and when I say security staff, sometimes they're full-time security staff, sometimes they're IT people who cover security as well, because as we know, not every organization can afford a dedicated security team. But even in places where they do, I've talked to people who've said to me, we have analysis paralysis. Because what we hear from the industry is that everything is a priority. 1 million things are a priority. So which priority do we prioritize? Where do we get started? Consumers, individual consumers, won't even engage to that level. They won't bother with the analysis. They'll just disengage and move on. That's what they've done for years. And we make the problem worse with the language choices we use. We use technical jargon all day amongst ourselves, and that's fine. I'll give you a minute to read the XKCD, it's fine. It's fine to use jargon with each other, but when we talk to other people, we got to focus on the impact. We got to focus on why it should matter to them. We have to speak their language. It's actually, honestly, it's like any good negotiation. You start where the people you want to negotiate with are, what they care about, and then you work them back to where you are. And if we're not using jargon, we're going way the other way. Who wants to talk about Cyber Pearl Harbor? Or cyber bullets, pew pew. We had a lot of that in the run-up to Russia-Ukraine, and it's really alienating for people. It's scary. They don't know what to make of it. We also really love, who knows the term FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt? We love to use that to tell people the world is on fire. And, kind of is, but messages of hope and positivity will actually make people feel that they can be part of the conversation and part of the process much more than just making them feel like they're being told off. We're not always known for our empathy. Dan yesterday talked about Dave from accounting. The truth is, we're all Dave from accounting. Clicking on links is sort of what you do on the internet. And as deepfakes get better, phishing attacks will get so much more credible. And even the people in this room who are really savvy and really cautious will potentially fall victim to them. We have to stop a dialogue where we make fun of people for falling victim to things and where we make them feel ashamed. Because until we destigmatize it, we can't actually have a really honest conversation about it. People don't want to report things today because they're worried about what will happen. They're worried about getting in trouble. They're worried about loss of customer confidence. They're worried about getting mocked. They're worried about a loss of stock value. And that means we, as a community, are poorer for it because we lack the data on what's really happening. So actually, we need to figure out how to shift the dynamics on this. We have to take the recrimination out of security, because otherwise we're never going to have those positive conversations. And we'll never get buy-in from leadership, who, by the way, are the people who give us our resources, who give us the money to do things. But today, leadership, we know, are bombarded. I mean, if you're in Europe, the chances are your leadership are dealing with a whole lot of questions around the economy, and they're trying to not have to be in a situation of making difficult decisions about layoffs. And so when they get told, security is important too, and we've made it so alien for them and scary and hard to get involved in the conversation, they're going to do what they do today. They're going to go, you know what? We're not really a target, it's fine. Because people don't understand what it means to be a target of cybercrime, because we haven't made it easy for them to understand that. So we have to get better at how we talk about this, or people will always think of it as somebody else's problem. That's what we've done. We've told them it's not their thing to worry about, it's our thing to worry about. And it is, because we're the experts. And we also really want to have jobs, and there's great job security in being the expert, until people stop caring altogether. And that's the problem, right? We have to figure out how to get them involved in the conversation. And we have to reach new audiences to do that. Talking to people in small to medium businesses is super hard, because they have so many messages and so little resources. But small to medium businesses make up the majority of our economy. In many cases, they make up the organizations that provide our critical infrastructure. And we don't talk to them well. We talk to each other well. So we have to figure out how to change that dynamic. In security, we have a little thing we like to say: there's no silver bullets. There's no easy wins or quick fixes, right? And this is true, absolutely true. All of the things I'm throwing at you today do not have easy wins or quick fixes. The problem is that it can lead to this thing called the law of triviality. So in 1957, a guy called C. Northcott Parkinson, had to learn his name. It's quite the name. He came out with this thing around the law of triviality, and he used an example to illustrate it. The example he used was of a group of people building a fictional power station. And rather than focusing on the very, very, very important, necessary questions, the difficult questions of how to make the power station safe, instead, they spent all of their time arguing over what the employee bike sheds should be made out of. And maybe when you think about it, you can think of situations in security where you've seen something a little bit like this, where we've focused on solving problems that maybe aren't quite as critical, or maybe we've focused on solving a piece of a very critical problem, but the piece that we focused on hasn't been the piece that we really needed to focus on. Now, if that happens in a security industry amongst people who actually really know what they're talking about and spend all day talking about it, it's annoying, but it's manageable, right? And we can get past it. What happens when it's governments who are not generally deep security experts? They haven't worked years in security. What happens then when they're trying to come up with solutions and it devolves into an exercise of being seen to do a thing, because actually it's really hard for them to solve the problem? This is why we need more voices involved in policy. These are pictures of security experts and me, testifying to government on security issues. The reason there's a picture of me included is because I could only find 2 pictures from the UK. And it's possible that there's just not a lot of pictures out there, but lots of people are testifying every day to UK Parliament. I suspect that it's more likely that there's just not that many people who've done it. And hey, you should do it. It's really good fun. Highly recommend it. They need to hear from you guys because you're the experts. So to recap, this is the reality of your lives, right? We deal with a huge amount of complexity all the time. And you've constantly got messages and noise being thrown at you. But we're at a point of change. We're the second generation of security. And we have an opportunity to decide what we want to do differently. We have to do something different because the landscape is changing, and honestly, we're not winning. Governments are engaged, which means things are going to happen that will impact you, and consumers are not engaged, which means we're constantly rolling rocks uphill as people throw spears at us from the top, which, I don't know about you, but I don't enjoy that. The stakes are too high, and so change is definitely going to come. And so the question for all of you is, what do you want the future to be? As the people who have experience and knowledge in security and enough passion to be here in this room, you are powerful. You are a gift. And I'm telling you that both your industry and actually your society needs you. So my question to all of you is, what kind of red shirt do you want to be? Thank you very much. You've been an amazingly patient audience. Enjoy the rest of the conference.